Some truths are never destroyed. They are only buried in dust-covered filing boxes, in storage facilities that appear on no public map, in pages that no one was permitted to read for half a century. And sometimes, only sometimes, someone turns to exactly the right page. 1987, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Eileen Welsum was a reporter for a small local paper, not the Washington Post, not the New York Times. She had not been assigned to investigate anything in particular. She was simply sitting in a library, working her way through a 400-page Air Force technical report on the effects of nuclear radiation on combat pilots. Dry, technical, nothing worth noting across the first 36 pages, until page 37. At the bottom of that page, tucked into a footnote, printed in type smaller than the main text, the kind of footnote most readers skip entirely, was a single sentence. Some of the findings in this report were derived from direct human experimental data collected between 1945 and 1947. Eileen stopped. Direct human experimental data from 1945, just after the end of World War II, just after atomic bombs had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She read the sentence again. No names, no identities, no hospital, no location. Only a cold sequence of labels, HP1, HP2, HP3, all the way to HP18. 18 labels. 18 human beings, if they were human beings at all. And just below, an additional note stating that the subjects had been injected with plutonium directly into the bloodstream to track how the element dispersed through the body. Plutonium, the synthetic radioactive element used to build the bomb, dropped on Nagasaki in August 1945. A bomb that killed 80,000 people in seconds. That same element had been injected into people, into real people, with a needle, inside a hospital, and not a single word in that small footnote mentioned whether those people had agreed to it. Did they know? Were they ever asked? Where were they now? Or had they been gone for years, never knowing what had been done to their bodies? Eileen set the document down. She stared at the sequence, HP1, HP2, HP3. Behind each of those numbers was a person, someone with a name, a family, a life. Someone who had walked into a hospital trusting that the doctors there were there to help them. And for 42 years, from the moment those experiments took place to the afternoon, Eileen was sitting in that library. No one had given those numbers a name. No one had told those people, or their children, or their grandchildren, the truth about what had happened. The truth had not been destroyed. It was still there, lying quietly in filing boxes, behind locked archive doors, waiting. Eileen Welsum decided to find it. And what she uncovered over the next 6 years was worse than anything she could have imagined on that afternoon in 1987. To understand why these experiments happened, we need to go back to 1942. That August, President Roosevelt signed the order launching the Manhattan Project, the most secretive, most expensive, and largest weapons development program in American history up to that point. More than 130,000 people worked across 30 sites stretching from New Mexico to Tennessee to Washington State. The budget, in today's dollars, was the equivalent of roughly $30 billion, and most of those people had no idea what they were actually building. Secrecy was maintained through a system called compartmentalization. Workers in Building A knew nothing about Building B. Operators running equipment had no idea what that equipment was for. Scientists at one site had no access to results from another. But there was a small group, the physicians and medical physicists at the center of the project, who knew everything. And they had a problem. Plutonium, the synthetic radioactive element being used to build the bomb, was being handled directly by hundreds of workers at facilities like Oak Ridge in Tennessee and Hanford in Washington State. These workers were inhaling plutonium dust, absorbing plutonium vapor, potentially swallowing microscopic particles every single day. And the scientists had no reliable data on how much plutonium it took to kill a person. This was not because they lacked basic knowledge. In fact, they understood quite well what plutonium did inside a body. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. It releases alpha radiation as it decays. When alpha radiation occurs inside the body, it doesn't pass through the way gamma rays do. Instead, all of that energy concentrates into the surrounding tissue. Plutonium seeks out bone. Specifically, it binds to bone marrow, where the body produces blood cells. Once it gets in, it doesn't leave. It sits there, decaying day by day, irradiating the marrow tissue from the inside for decades. The Manhattan Project's physicians knew this. They knew it because they had spent years studying the radium dial painters. Women who had worked in New Jersey factories in the 1920s, licking their brushes to create a fine point with radium-laced luminous paint, ingesting trace amounts with every stroke. Those women died of bone cancer and blood cancer in terrible pain. Their jawbones literally crumbled apart. What the doctors did not yet have was precise dosage data on humans. How many micrograms were safe? How many guaranteed illness? At what rate did the body excrete plutonium, and through what mechanisms? After how many years did symptoms begin to appear? Theoretical models and animal studies were not sufficient to establish occupational safety standards for hundreds of workers. They needed data from real people. And that is when some of the Manhattan Project's physicians began putting forward a proposal that, written plainly, read like this: let us inject hospitalized patients with plutonium and observe what happens. Not to cure them, to collect data. What is notable is that this discussion did not take place in total secrecy. It existed in meeting minutes, in internal correspondence. Those documents, later, when declassified, show that some physicians did raise ethical concerns. But most of the discussion centered on technical questions: how to measure results, what dosage level to begin with, and critically, how to keep what was being done from becoming known outside the program. The final decision: proceed with the injections. March 24, 1945. Eb Cade, 53 years old, was injured in a car accident near the Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee, one of the Manhattan Project's classified sites. He was brought to Oak Ridge Hospital as an emergency admission. His left arm and right leg were broken. Otherwise, he was stable. Eb Cade was a Black American. He worked as a construction laborer at Oak Ridge, one of many Black workers hired to build the project's infrastructure, given no information whatsoever about the true purpose of the work they were doing. At the hospital, doctors were preparing to set and cast his broken bones. But before treatment began, before his bones had even been set, a nurse injected a clear solution into the vein of his arm. He was told it was a standard supportive medication. That solution contained 4.7 micrograms of plutonium-239. 4.7 micrograms is an amount invisible to the naked eye. But according to calculations the Manhattan Project physicians had already run, based on data from the New Jersey dial painters, that dose was approximately 40 times the level they estimated would cause cancer if it remained in the body long enough. Eb Cade did not know this. He believed he was receiving medical care. Over the following month, while he remained hospitalized, doctors extracted 15 of his teeth. They took bone samples from multiple sites across his body. The purpose? To measure how much plutonium had accumulated in skeletal tissue after 1 month. These procedures were recorded in his medical file as routine clinical treatments. No one told Eb Cade anything about any of it. In May 1945, he was discharged. His bones had healed. He returned to his normal life and went back to work. In the Manhattan Project's records, he was logged under the identifier HP12. Eb Cade lived 8 more years after the injection. He died in 1953 of heart failure. Whether the plutonium lodged in his bones contributed to that death was never investigated. No one ever asked. His family did not learn what had happened to him until 1994, 49 years after the fact. Now let me tell you about Albert Stevens. May 1945, the same year as Eb Cade, a 58-year-old man named Albert Stevens was admitted to the University of California, San Francisco with severe stomach pain. Following clinical examination, doctors delivered a diagnosis: terminal cancer, estimated survival under 6 months. Because he was expected to die, and because his imminent death could be attributed to cancer rather than to anything done to him, Manhattan Project researchers determined he was an ideal subject. They injected him with a solution containing a mixture of plutonium-238 and plutonium-239. Total dosage: 131,000 units of radioactivity. By modern measurement, the highest dose ever documented in any subject across the entire program. But there was something the doctors had not anticipated. Albert Stevens's cancer diagnosis was completely wrong. He did not have cancer. He had a benign gastric ulcer. After surgery to remove the affected portion of his stomach, he recovered fully. Albert Stevens kept living. Not 6 months as originally projected. Not 1 year. He lived for 21 more years after being injected with plutonium. He died in 1966 at the age of 79. Throughout those 21 years, researchers from the Manhattan Project, and later from the Atomic Energy Commission, periodically collected urine and stool samples from him to analyze the rate at which plutonium was being excreted. He was told this was part of a routine health monitoring program. He did not know he was being monitored as a long-term experimental subject. When he died in 1966, his family held a funeral and buried him. They believed his ashes belonged to him. They did not. A portion of Albert Stevens's ashes had been taken by researchers without notifying his family. The purpose? To analyze the plutonium content remaining in his bones after 21 years. His family did not learn this until 1994. These were the first 2 of 18 confirmed plutonium injection cases documented between 1945 and 1947. And we only know the number 18 because that is what was found in the records that survived. The actual total, no one knows. The plutonium injections were not an exception. They were part of a much larger system. Also in 1945, at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, a separate study was underway, and its subjects were not cancer patients or accident victims. They were pregnant women attending a free prenatal clinic at the university hospital. The study operated as follows. When the women came in for their appointments, they were given a special vitamin cocktail that nurses told them would help their babies develop more healthily. This was the only free prenatal clinic in the area serving low-income women, many of whom had no other option for pregnancy care. No one told them the cocktail contained radioactive iron, Fe59. The research goal was to track how iron moved across the placenta into the developing fetus, a legitimate scientific question. But the method, giving radioactive material to pregnant women without their knowledge or consent, was not acceptable under any ethical standard in existence at the time, including the standards that already existed. The Vanderbilt study continued for years. When outcomes were later analyzed, at least 3 children born from those pregnancies developed cancers in childhood. 1 of them died. A definitive causal link could not be established with certainty because the study did not follow long-term outcomes. It simply ended, without anyone ever following up with the subjects. In Massachusetts, beginning in 1946, another study was taking place at the Fernald State School, a residential institution for children with intellectual disabilities in Waltham. Researchers from MIT and Harvard approached the school with a proposal. They wanted to establish a science club for the boys living there. Members would receive special breakfasts featuring high-quality oatmeal, go on field trips, attend baseball games at Fenway Park. Parents signed consent forms. The forms stated, the boys will receive a special diet to monitor their development. The forms did not mention that the oatmeal served to club members each morning contained trace amounts of radioactive calcium and iron. They did not mention that the oats were supplied by the Quaker Oats Company. They did not mention that the entire study was funded by the Atomic Energy Commission. The goal was to track how children's bodies absorbed minerals, information that would be used to develop nutritional claims for breakfast cereals. Quaker Oats wanted scientific evidence that their product delivered essential minerals. These boys, children living in a state institution with no capacity to protect themselves, were the instruments used to generate commercial data. When some of them reached adulthood and discovered the truth in the 1990s, they filed a lawsuit. The case was settled in 1998 with a medical monitoring fund valued at $1.85 million. No one from MIT, Harvard, or Quaker Oats was criminally charged. But perhaps nothing was worse than what happened in Cincinnati. From 1960 to 1971, at Cincinnati General Hospital, Dr. Eugene Sanger, a radiation oncologist at the University of Cincinnati, carried out what our records called whole-body radiation research. He irradiated cancer patients with full-body radiation doses ranging from 25 to 300 rads in a single session. To put those numbers in context, doses above 200 rads cause acute radiation syndrome, severe nausea, hair loss, internal bleeding, and immune system collapse. A dose of 300 rads delivered to the whole body carries a significant probability of death within 30 days in a person receiving no supportive treatment. Sanger did not irradiate these patients because he believed the doses would benefit them. His patients were in advanced stages of cancer, and for most of them, the radiation doses far exceeded standard therapeutic thresholds. The actual purpose, stated explicitly in the military funding contract, was to study the effects of nuclear radiation on battlefield performance. In a nuclear war, soldiers would be exposed to radiation. The U.S. Army wanted to know, after absorbing a given number of rads, how long could a person continue to function and fight? The patients were not told they were subjects of a military research study. According to demographic analysis conducted by the 1994 Advisory Committee using surviving records, these patients were disproportionately poor, and more than 60% were Black Americans. At least 8 of them died within 30 days of being irradiated. Eugene Sanger continued practicing medicine and teaching at university for decades. In 1997, 3 years after his experiments had become national news, he was awarded the Gold Medal of the Radiological Society of North America for contributions to science. He died in 2007 at the age of 90. No criminal charges were ever filed. Back to Eileen Wellsome, the woman sitting in a library in Albuquerque in 1987, staring at a footnote. She began doing what an investigative reporter is trained to do: ask questions. The first question: who are the people behind HP 1 through HP 18? The answer she received from the U.S. Department of Energy, the agency that had inherited the Atomic Energy Commission's records, was this: that information is classified for national security reasons. 1987, 42 years after the injections. The identities of people who had been injected with plutonium were still a classified state secret. Eileen did not stop. She spent the next 2 years reading everything publicly accessible about the Manhattan Project: partially declassified reports, technical documents, official histories. She built a list of hospitals mentioned, doctors named, facilities connected to the program. In 1989, she filed a formal request under the Freedom of Information Act. Denied. She appealed. Denied again. She escalated the appeal to the next level in the system. In 1990, she received a box of documents, a fraction of what she had requested, with large portions redacted. But among the pages that had not been blacked out, she found one detail: the name of a hospital in Texas, where one of the experimental subjects had been treated. She went to Texas. This is the part of the work that no journalism school can teach. Knocking on doors, she began searching through local records, birth and death registries, old telephone directories. She talked to retired nurses, hospital archivists, elderly residents in the community. In 1993, 6 years after the afternoon she had found that footnote, Eileen Wellsome published a series of investigative articles in the Albuquerque Tribune. The headline of the first piece: The Plutonium Experiment. For the first time in history, the label HP-12 had a name, Eb Cade. Cal-1 had a name, Albert Stevens. And one by one, the other anonymous identifiers began to acquire human faces. The initial response from the U.S. Department of Energy in the days after publication: no comment. But Washington had read the articles. Hazel O'Leary, the Secretary of Energy appointed by President Clinton just months earlier, read Eileen Wellsome's reporting. She called her staff in and asked a simple question: how much more is in our files? The answer her staff brought back after several weeks of internal review was one that kept her awake at night. Not 18 cases, not dozens. They were looking at evidence of hundreds of experiments involving thousands of subjects conducted across 3 decades. In January 1994, President Clinton signed an executive order establishing the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. The committee was given 18 months to investigate. The 1994 Advisory Committee worked for 18 months. They reviewed millions of pages of documents and took testimony from scientists, former government officials, and, most importantly, from surviving victims and the families of those who had died. The final report, released in October 1995, ran to more than 900 pages. Its central finding: between 1944 and 1974, the United States government had funded and conducted at least 4,000 radiation experiments on human beings. Estimated number of subjects: tens of thousands, the majority of whom had not been informed and had not consented. The committee also uncovered something that made the entire picture worse. As early as 1947, only 2 years after the first injections, the physicians running the program had drafted their own internal consent standards. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They wrote rules for themselves. And then they spent the next several decades violating those rules. But there was something the report could not convey through numbers and statistics alone. On January 3, 1994, Elmerine Whitfield Bell sat before the advisory committee and began to testify. She was the daughter-in-law of Elmer Allen, a 36-year-old black man who worked as a railroad porter and was admitted to the University of California, San Francisco in 1947 following an injury to his leg. Elmer Allen was injected with plutonium 3 days after admission. 4 days after that, his leg was amputated. His medical records, once declassified, revealed that the amputation was not indicated by his injury alone. It was performed in part because it was convenient for the research, removing tissue that had been contaminated with plutonium for laboratory analysis. Elmer Allen went home with one leg. He was told nothing about what had been done to his body. In the years that followed, according to Elmerine and other family members, he became a changed man. He grew withdrawn. He was often angry, difficult to reach. He drank. He could not hold steady work. His family did not understand why. He carried it inside him, unknowing, for the rest of his life. When Elmerine stood before the committee in 1994, she said, "The government used my father-in-law. He was not treated as a human being. And the apology you are preparing to offer, I believe you have calculated that an apology costs less than genuine accountability." The committee included her testimony in the official record. In October 1995, President Clinton stood before cameras and apologized to the victims and their families. He called the experiments deeply troubling. He said the government had not acted appropriately. Not one person went to prison. Not one medical license was revoked. Not one institution was shut down. Eugene Sanger, the man who had irradiated dozens of Cincinnati patients with potentially lethal doses, accepted a Lifetime Achievement Medal from his professional society in 1997. Eileen Welsom's series in the Albuquerque Tribune won the Pulitzer Prize in 1994, the highest honor in American journalism. That is the good ending in a story that has very few of them. But the true ending of this story, if it can be called an ending, lies in a detail recorded by the advisory committee inside their 900-page report, in a short passage near the final pages of the document. The committee wrote, "They could not determine the full scope of human radiation experimentation because the documentation was incomplete. Some records had been destroyed, some had never been properly maintained, and some, as of the date the report was finalized in 1995, were still classified and had not been made fully available to the committee's own researchers." In other words, even after the largest investigation into this subject in American history, there were things the committee was not permitted to see. The infants given radioactive iodine injections in 1945 would be nearly 80 years old today, if they are still alive. The majority of them have never been officially identified, contacted, or compensated. The pregnant women at Vanderbilt who drank radioactive cocktails, many of them have been gone for years, never knowing what was put into their bodies. And somewhere in federal archives, inside filing boxes that may still carry a classification stamp, are the names of others. People we do not yet know about. People whose stories have not been told. Eileen Welsom did not only find the name behind HP-12, she proved something simpler than that, and more important, that asking questions, even after being refused, even when it takes years, can still force the truth out into the open. Not because the system wanted that truth to be known, but because there was someone who refused to stop asking. And that may be the only thing in this entire story that any of us can actually control. If you want to read the primary source, the final report of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments was fully declassified and is available through the U.S. Department of Energy. It was published in October 1995.